You're cold before you even open your eyes. The air smells of iron and tallow. Beneath your skin, something tears. Pain, ancient and unspeakable, blooms in your belly as snow hisses against the window glass. You are 13, and the future of England is trying to claw its way out of your body. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten corridor of history, take a moment to tell us where in the world you're watching from. It's a strange and wondrous thing to explore these centuries-old stories from every corner of the globe, linked not by blood, but by curiosity. If you're drawn to history's buried truths, consider subscribing for more stories that lie hidden in dust and stone. It is January, 1457. In the drafty bedchamber of Bletsoe Castle, Lady Margaret Beaufort bleeds onto the sheets while midwives chant soft Latin prayers that blur into the crackle of frost on the windows. Her hands, narrow and trembling, cling to the mattress. No child of her age should know this kind of pain. But Margaret is not allowed to be a child. In the corner of the room stands her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, stern-faced, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. She knows the danger. Childbirth at 13 is not a test of endurance. It is a coin toss. And the stakes are no longer just survival. Inside that fragile womb is the last male heir of a crumbling royal bloodline. That child will be named Henry. One day he will be king. But that day feels far away now, buried under the weight of centuries-old politics and the cruel machinery of marriage alliances. Margaret Beaufort had not fallen in love. She had been placed, like a rook on a chessboard, into a union with Edmund Tudor, a man nearly twice her age, driven not by affection, but ambition. Their marriage was arranged in 1455, during a lull in the Wars of the Roses, when alliances were made in hushed council chambers and sanctified with the bodies of young girls. The ceremony was held in Bletsoe's chapel. The tapestries were vibrant, but the bride's shoes were too big. Margaret, small even for her age, barely filled out her wedding gown. Edmund Tudor, half-brother to the king, was ambitious, calculating. He saw in Margaret a gateway to Lancastrian legitimacy. Through her he could bind his name to the Plantagenet bloodline, specifically that of John of Gaunt, son of Edward III. It was a dangerous pedigree, rich with both promise and peril. The consummation was immediate. There was no waiting, not for consent, not for maturity. In the medieval mind, marriage to a noblewoman, no matter her age, was a political tool sharpened with urgency. Margaret spoke little of her wedding night in later years, but its echo lived in her limp, the way she winced climbing stairs, and the fact that she never bore another child. By the time she realized she was pregnant, Edmund was gone. Seized during a campaign in Wales and imprisoned at Carmarthen Castle, he died before the year was out. Officially, the cause was plague. Unofficially, well, that depends on which chronicle you read. Some whispered he was poisoned, others that he was executed under cover of darkness. Margaret never learned the truth. She was already in confinement, her body straining to house a growing life it was never meant to bear. The people around her marveled at her composure. Grave beyond her years, one monk would write later. But what choice did she have? In a time when noble daughters were assets to be spent, Margaret became currency, exchanged again and again in the name of dynastic survival. And still, in the chamber that winter night, there was no dignity. The blood was everywhere. One of the midwives whispered a psalm. The snow had stopped falling outside. Silence crept in. Then came the cry. Not from Margaret, but from the child. A thin, fierce wail. The baby was alive. A boy. They named him Henry. But Margaret's recovery was slow. She had torn internally, perhaps beyond repair. Her hips, narrow, unready, had barely accommodated the birth. Her body would never bear another child. From that day forward, she turned instead to other kinds of labor: prayer, politics, plotting. She would dress only in widow's black, even as the years passed. Her son, taken from her almost immediately to be raised in protective households, would grow up knowing his mother more by letter than lullaby. And yet, the seed was planted. A boy born in blood and snow, a mother forged in suffering. It would take 30 years of exile, subterfuge, and slaughter before Henry would return to England to seize the crown. But that story, like a knife hidden in silk, waits in the next chapter. For now, remember this. Before England's most enduring dynasty was born, before the Tudors painted the world with roses and reform, it all began in a freezing room where a girl too young to vote in modern times was asked to die to create a king. The air inside Carmarthen Castle was cold even in autumn, and the cell where Edmund Tudor died stank of mildew and sweat. Outside, the leaves turned red, as if the trees themselves bled for the crumbling peace of England. Margaret, newly a widow, newly a mother, stood wrapped in mourning black while Yorkist banners snapped in the wind like taunts. She had buried a husband she barely knew, and now, alone, she faced a kingdom that wanted her child erased. The Wars of the Roses had begun, and Margaret Beaufort, barely 14, was a piece on a board now smeared with blood. She did not carry a sword. She wielded something older, bloodline. Though England burned in the clash between Lancaster and York, Margaret's worth remained undeniable. Through her veins ran the legacy of John of Gaunt, son of Edward III. She was no common noblewoman. She was dynastic gold, and she knew it. But lineage alone could not protect her. In a realm where loyalties turned faster than seasons, Margaret was shuffled like a token between men who saw in her either threat or opportunity. Her son, young Henry Tudor, was sent away to Wales, to be raised in the shadows, hidden from Yorkist eyes. Margaret, meanwhile, was maneuvered into a new marriage. It was a political transaction, not a reprieve. Sir Henry Stafford, her second husband, was the nephew of the powerful Duke of Buckingham. He was cautious, moderate, a man trying to stay afloat in a world coming apart. The match was intended to cool tensions, to keep Margaret quietly neutral. But even in her silence, she watched. She listened. She waited. In her household, whispers flew like ash, of battles, beheadings, betrayals. The Duke of York had challenged the mentally fragile King Henry VI for the crown. In 1461, York's son, Edward IV, seized it. The red rose of Lancaster wilted beneath the white. Margaret, Lancastrian to the bone, kept her prayers quiet and her loyalties quieter still. Henry Stafford supported York, at least outwardly. It was a necessity. But Margaret walked a razor's edge, loyal to her blood, but married into Yorkist circles. Her life depended on performance. Still, she never stopped writing. She sent letters to Jasper Tudor, her brother-in-law, now in exile. She sought updates on her son, his health, his education, his safety. Every word carried risk. But Margaret had learned early that silence was not survival. Control was. She began cultivating allies among the church, among courtiers, among women who managed estates while their husbands marched off to war. Slowly, carefully, she built a web, not of power, but of information. Her son remained the last real Lancastrian heir. Everyone knew it. Sooner or later, that fact would matter again. In 1471, everything changed. Henry VI's brief restoration to the throne, engineered by the Earl of Warwick, collapsed in blood. Edward IV returned and crushed the rebellion at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Prince Edward, the Lancastrian heir, was slain. Days later, Henry VI died mysteriously in the Tower. To many, it looked like the end of Lancaster. But not to Margaret. Her son, hidden across the sea in Brittany, still lived. And now, he was the only one. Stafford, her second husband, died of wounds sustained in that same year. Once again, Margaret was in black. Once again, she was alone. But not for long. She set her sights on a new alliance, this time not for safety, but strategy. In 1472, she married Thomas Stanley, Lord High Constable of England, a man as politically elusive as he was powerful. Stanley had survived every twist of the war by never choosing sides until the last possible moment. He was no romantic partner, but Margaret didn't need romance. She needed reach. Stanley had it. Together they formed a pact as cold as it was calculated. Margaret would bide her time within Yorkist court society. She would flatter, nod, and appear loyal. All the while her eyes stayed fixed across the channel. Her son was growing into a man, and Edward IV, for all his power, was mortal. In the shadows of court banquets and prayer chambers, Margaret plotted. She funded scholars to advise her son. She hired messengers who crossed seas under cover of night. She whispered to those discontent with York, and fanned the flames of every rumor that Edward's rule was not divinely sanctioned. And when Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, Margaret made her boldest move yet. She reached out to his widow, Elizabeth Woodville. The two women had every reason to be enemies, but both had sons with royal blood, and both knew the man who now claimed the throne, Richard III, was not to be trusted. Together they began to weave the plan that would change England forever, a marriage alliance between Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York, a joining of red rose and white. But that moment of reckoning was still to come. For now, Margaret lit a candle in the chapel at Stanley's estate. She knelt, fingers knotted in prayer, lips murmuring petitions to saints who did not answer quickly. She had survived 3 crowns, 2 husbands, and 1 civil war. And somewhere across the sea, the son she had nearly died to birth was preparing to return home. But he would not come alone, and England would never be the same. London's bells did not ring for Margaret Beaufort that morning, but they may as well have. Cloaked in black and shadowed by incense, she walked behind her son as he passed beneath the city's towering gates, not as an exile or usurper, but as England's crowned king. Her lips moved in silent prayer. Her hands, gloved and steady, had pulled strings from behind altar rails and curtain walls. Now, those strings had drawn a crown from blood-soaked mud. Henry VII wore the coronet. But the victory, it was hers. She had played the long game. By 1483, Margaret's son had spent nearly half his life in exile, separated from her, hunted by Yorkist eyes, and raised among Breton lords. But from across the sea, she never stopped maneuvering. While Richard III seized the throne and the princes in the Tower disappeared, Margaret set her plan in motion, not with sword or soldier, but with parchment, whispers, and alliances written in ink and ambition. She proposed the impossible, that her Lancastrian son would marry Elizabeth of York, the very embodiment of the enemy, and unite the warring houses in a single heir. It was political heresy to some, salvation to others. In secret, she and Elizabeth Woodville, mother of the vanished princes, exchanged letters. Messengers passed through abbeys concealed beneath monkish robes. One was caught and flayed, another vanished on the road to Exeter. But the message endured. Bring Henry back, marry the houses, end the war. Richard III knew of Margaret's schemes. He placed her under house arrest in her husband Stanley's estates. But Stanley was slippery. He gave oaths the way others gave handshakes, frequently and with little intention to keep them. Margaret was officially contained. Unofficially, she was still at court, still writing, still plotting. When Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven in the summer of 1485, his army was small, half French, half Welsh. No one expected much. The Yorkists laughed. Richard sharpened his sword. But Margaret had done her work well. She had stirred old loyalties, leaned on debts, reminded lords of past favors and future safety, and, most crucially, she had whispered to Stanley. At Bosworth Field, with the crown literally resting in a saddlebag beside Richard's horse, Thomas Stanley made his move. His forces, withheld until the moment mattered, charged, not for the king he served, but for the son of the woman he had married. Richard died with crown and courage intact, but without allies. Henry was declared king on the battlefield, and the crown was placed on his head by Stanley's own hand. Margaret had won, but victory did not mean retreat. Margaret Beaufort did not fade into ceremony. She moved into the heart of Tudor governance, into council meetings and financial audits, into wardships and royal arrangements. She signed letters as Margaret R., a signature usually reserved for reigning monarchs. She styled herself My Lady the King's Mother, a title new to England and heavy with implication. At court, she was everywhere, in the royal apartments, at the exchequer, in the king's confidence. Though she never officially ruled, Henry consulted her more than he did his own wife. Foreign envoys noted it with unease. The king's mother is much feared and of great authority. She arranged marriages, oversaw the education of her grandchildren, and maintained her own staff, her own lands, and her own household laws. Even Queen Elizabeth of York deferred to her, as did most of the realm. But Margaret was more than a court architect. She was the architect of stability. She saw that England bled itself dry in civil war, and she would not allow it again. She enforced silence where there had been plots, lineage where there had been chaos, marriages where there had been daggers. She understood power, not its noise, but its weight. Yet she remained devout. She woke before dawn to hear Mass. She fasted. She gave generously to colleges and cathedrals, founding Christ's College and St. John's College in Cambridge. Scholars found in her a patron, the poor a benefactor, but none ever mistook her piety for softness. She had survived Edmund's bed, Stafford's neutrality, Stanley's duplicity, and Richard's fury. She had built a king with no army, ruled a court with no crown, and forged a peace with no mercy. And when her son's wife died, leaving behind the boy who would become Henry VII, it was Margaret who planned the funeral and the future in the same breath. She died in 1509, just days after her son. The old struggle had claimed them both, but not before she passed the torch to her grandson, a boy bold and brutal in ways she could never be. But it was she who made his reign possible. The Tudor rose bloomed from her agony, her patience, and her power. They buried her in Westminster Abbey beneath a carved effigy that shows her in prayer, draped in her widow's robes, lips closed, hands folded. But make no mistake, she was never just praying. She was planning, and England would never be ruled the same way again.